Okay. Y'all come on in, grab a seat. We're going to start our Romans Bible study. I meant to put some in the e-news. I don't remember if I did or not. But we are starting the Romans Bible study today. And so, I don't know, help us out, help me out. If you see a buddy that's not in here today, tell them, hey, we're starting Romans. Come on, be a part of it. Invite somebody. If you see a buddy in your neighborhood, they don't have to go to church here to be part of the Romans Bible study. They're allowed to be here. You can invite them too, okay? So we're starting Romans. I'm going to give some introductory comments today. How long is this Bible study? Usually I tell you how long a Bible study is. This is an 8-week Bible study. This is a 10-week Bible study. I don't know. And here's why I don't know. Romans is a really long, also thick letter, okay? So I just really don't know how long it's going to take us to get through it. I don't want to rush certain parts. If you get sick of it and you want a hiatus and we'll do something else, then come back like Romans part 2. You know what I mean? Like we'll do whatever you got to do. You let me know as we go, because I just really don't know how long this is going to take to get through this. What's that?
Thursday morning, we don't know.
Yeah, you don't know. Yeah. So this is my first, okay, I'm going to tell y'all something. This is my first time ever teaching Paul's letter to the Romans. Ever. This is my maiden voyage with y'all. Really? I know. Some of you are shocked by this. Here's why it's my first time ever teaching Paul's letter to the Romans. Because teaching Paul's letter, like reading Paul's letter to the Romans, I love doing it. I'll read it. I love to read it. I read it over and over. Teaching Paul's letter to the Romans fills me with fear and trembling. Okay? Why does it fill me with fear and trembling to teach this book with y'all? It makes me nervous for 2 reasons. Number one, Romans is central to Lutheran doctrine and identity. And you might think to yourself, well, Pastor Will, if Romans is central to Lutheran doctrine and identity, whatever that means, right? I'll talk to you about what it means. But if it's central to Lutheran doctrine and identity, why would you not teach it? Why would you not teach it often? Well, because whenever I've tried to talk to Lutherans about what Lutheranism is, here's been my experience. So this one time, I've told y'all the story, but I'll tell it to you again. This one time I was trying to talk to a group of Lutherans where I was the pastor in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I was talking to them about the current state of the Lutheran Church in the world, not the United States, in the world. And I was telling them stuff like that I've said with y'all. Today, most Lutherans in the world are from East Africa. Okay? We are barely 2 million people sopping wet, and that's if we kind of inflate some of our numbers. There's 9 million members of the Lutheran Church of Ethiopia, just the Lutheran Church of Ethiopia. So most, and that doesn't include Tanzania, Kenya, Madagascar, all these other places. Most Lutherans in the world are black folks, y'all, today. Forget Martin Luther in Germany. Go on safari in East Africa and look at some lions and zebras. That's where all the Lutherans are, okay? So I was telling them stuff like this, which I thought was fun and exciting facts, you know, like fun and exciting facts with Will, okay? And then I'm going down the hallways in this church and I hear this woman, and first of all, Lutheran doesn't mean the same thing down south as it means up here anyway. Because this gal was from a family that had been Lutheran for at least a couple generations, okay? But she was originally from Eastern Kentucky. Where they talk like this? You know what I'm talking about? No? Nobody knows anybody from Appalachia? Okay. Where they talk like this? And so she was on her phone and she was talking to somebody, like one of her buddies she knew, and she was talking about my presentation on the current state of world Lutheranism. And I heard her say, well, you know, it was okay. You know, it's okay. We had a non-Lutheran tell us what it means to be Lutheran. Because I'm an adult convert, right? So because Romans is central to Lutheran doctrine and identity, I've always been nervous to teach it because I am an adult convert. Now, to be said, I've now been a Lutheran longer than I ever was a Baptist. So y'all got to, at some point, start considering me Lutheran. You know what I mean? At some point, you're going to have to catch me, like, give me a break. But at the same time, I know that it's central to Lutheran doctrine and identity. And so I've been nervous to teach it as someone who didn't grow up in the Lutheran church, like any Lutheran church, okay? The second reason that I approach this with some anxiety is that Romans is a tour de force in its own right. When I say that, what do I mean? Romans is one of those documents that has shaped all of world history. And I know the Bible had, I mean, specifically Romans. If all anybody had to read was just Romans and they didn't have anything else, it still would have shaped world history. Because what Paul lines up in this letter to the Romans is so deep and so profound that it has had an impact on every generation that has ever read the letter. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So the Bible, of course, has impacted world history, but specifically just the letter to the Romans has changed all of Western history and then world history after that, okay? So I've always been a little bit nervous to teach it because I'm like, what if I do it wrong? You know what I mean? When I taught y'all Revelation, I always think it's funny the way y'all look at things and the way I look at things. Y'all are like, Revelation is confusing and hard. And I'm like, no, I love this book. This is great. Let's come take a journey with me. And then we went through Revelation. And that's one of those books that's had an impact on world history, but not the same. Why? Because it was a letter written to insiders. Romans is a letter to insiders and people who are not yet insiders. So it had a broader approach from the very beginning. Does that make sense? It was meant to be read by insiders to the faith and those who are not yet insiders. And so that's one of the reasons why Romans has had the impact that it's had. Okay? So you're gonna have to bear with me unless you ask the elders for me to use my gifts elsewhere and you call a new pastor. This is my maiden voyage with y'all through the letter to the Romans, okay? So let's start with some background and make sure that we're clear. By the way, that's a unicle that I have up there for you. What's a unicle? It's a fragment of a manuscript that is actually the book of Romans. You're welcome. So how are we supposed to read it, Pastor Will? There's a big hole in it. We're going to do a class on text study a different day, okay? Not today. But that's a fragment of the book of Romans. So let's talk about the author, the date, and the intended audience. St. Paul sort of wrote it, and Tertius the scribe actually wrote it, okay? First of all, let's start with St. Paul. St. Paul is Saul of Tarsus, right? And then Jesus changed his name to Paul. Everybody familiar enough with that part, who St. Paul is? Okay. St. Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. There have been scholars who have tried to make their bones by publishing something that argued that Paul did not write Romans. Their arguments are not very strong. It's pretty well known that Paul wrote Romans. If we can say that Paul wrote any letter, we can say that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. Everybody with me? Okay. So you don't have to worry about whether Paul wrote this or somebody else did. Paul wrote it. When I say sort of, here's what I mean. Romans and 1 Corinthians both are extremely long letters. It was not common for people to write really long letters like this. Think of how many times you have written someone a letter the same length as the letter to the Romans. Most of the time it's a Hallmark card, thinking of you, right? Like it's that kind of thing. Or if it was a love letter, it might have been a couple pages, maybe 3 if you were, effusive about your love or something. But it's not going to be chapters and chapters and chapters and chapters and chapters. It's not going to be like that. So this letter was really long. So in order to produce this letter and make sure that it was correct and make sure that it was legible, it was very common in the Roman Empire at this time to use a scribe or secretary. If you've ever noticed at the very end of the book of Romans, the very last chapter, the very last verses, it says, I, Tertius, wrote this letter. Tertius is the scribe, the secretary that Paul hired to physically write the letter to for him. And then Paul dictated the letter. So some scholars question, well, how much did Tertius shape what was being dictated? Maybe, but you know what? A good secretary is sort of like a good translator. They're not going to shape the message in a way that you didn't intend. They're going to translate it accurately. They're going to take down the dictation accurately. Are y'all with me? So again, the way it works in academia is you publish a paper that questions everything that everybody thinks they know, and then they give you a PhD. Like, I'm sorry, but that's the way the game's played. See, you know what I'm talking about over here. So that's the way the game is played sometimes. I don't play that game. Instead, I look for something that no one said a whole lot about, and that way whatever I said was new. That's how I play the game. So I don't do, though, the thing where you question something that everybody knows is true. Paul wrote this letter. He dictated it. Tertius wrote it down accurately. Everybody with me? This is what we know to be true. Let's just leave it there, okay? It was written during Paul's third missionary journey, likely during a 3-month stay in Corinth. The problem with numbering Paul, how many missionary journeys did Paul go on? We're in Acts as the first reading in church in the Easter season. Let's see how many of us know our book of Acts. How many missionary journeys Paul go on? So 3, somebody said 7. Somebody said 4. All right. I love this. Here's your answer. The only correct answer is we don't know. Why do we not know? Well, wait a minute, Pastor Will. I've read the book of Acts, and there are 3 journeys that are outlined in the book of Acts. Yes, there are 3 journeys that are outlined in the book of Acts, and I don't have the Bible memorized, but it's something along the lines of chapter 13 or 14, chapter 16, and chapter 19, right? Of Acts. There are 3 missionary journeys outlined in Acts. Paul goes on in other epistles to outline yet other missionary journeys, and in Romans, he says that he means to go to Spain. Did he ever make it or not? We don't know. So he could have gone on 3 missionary journeys. He went on more than 3. He could have gone on 4 if he made it to Spain. He probably went on many others because he outlines them in his other epistles. We don't know how many he went on. We only know that he basically single-handedly started the Christianization of Europe. He's a hard worker, okay? He was a single guy. He didn't have a wife, and he didn't have ESPN. All he did was work, okay? And this guy planted a bunch of churches. We don't know how many that he went on. When I say his third missionary journey, I mean the third one that you can read in the book of Acts. Everybody with me? So chapter 19 of Acts. That one that you can read about in the book of Acts, that's the third one I'm referring to. And he likely wrote it during a 3-month stay in Corinth because we know he had a 3-month layover in Corinth where he was working with a church plant that he started, and then he had time to write this letter. That likely puts this letter somewhere around AD 55 or 56. We can't tell, but it's within a 2-year span, 55 or 56. Everybody with me? Okay. Who are the addressees? In some of these, you know exactly who the addressee is or who the addressees are, like 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We know that's the church that Paul started in the town of Corinth. Everybody with me? Philemon was written to a dude named Philemon. You with me? Galatians was written to the church that Paul had planted at Galatia. Paul didn't start the church in Rome. Christianity had made it to Rome before Paul ever got there. Why? It's the imperial capital. New stuff gets there quick. Christianity had already made its way to Rome before Paul ever wrote this letter. So Paul did not start these churches, and there were a bunch of them. I'll go into that in a minute. There were a bunch of churches already in Rome, and Paul didn't start any of them, not a single one. So who are the addressees? We don't really know. Here's our best guess. Because we know that Christianity made its way to Rome before Paul ever got there, we know a little bit about the early shape of Christianity from extra biblical resources. So in other words, Roman historians. Okay? And what do we know? We know that these first churches in the city of Rome were organized as house churches. They weren't in synagogues, they were in house churches. So they were in wealthy people's homes. So when we say house churches, we don't mean a humble abode. We mean wealthy people who had space to get, I don't know, 25, 50 people, maybe as many as 100, but that would have been a lot. You know how you walk into a party and you say, man, there's 1 million people in here. Not the parties you go to. All right. Or when some of us were younger, man, there's 1 million people in here, right? In Rome, they would have walked into the same party and said, man, there's 100 people in here. World population just wasn't what it is today. And so your scale was different. And I know that because I had to study classical Latin. Look at me. Can you see that my eyes are crossed? I had to study classical Latin. And so I knew some of these cultural tics about the Romans. One of the things that they would say is they walked into a party, man, there's 100 people in here. So when you think about how many people could fit into the Colosseum and why that was such a big deal, right? It's because their scale is different. So some of these house churches may have had 100 people in them, but that would have been a really huge church. They would have been like, man, it's a mega church. There's 100 people in here, right? A lot of these house churches were smaller, but wealthy people had space in their homes for a larger gathering. So these churches were organized around oftentimes wealthy people. Some of them had come out of Jewish synagogues. There were a good number of Jews living in the city of Rome. So some of these churches grew out of synagogue meetings. And then they met in a wealthy Jewish person's home. Some of these started as Romans who originally were interested in Judaism because of its emphasis on monotheism rather than the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods. They had already been interested in Judaism. And then when they heard the good news about Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, they were early adopters. But they were Gentiles. They were Greek, they were Roman, they were something non-Jewish. Everybody with me? So they had both Jewish meetings, Gentile meetings, and mixed meetings, everybody together. Those are the people that this letter is going to. Questions, problems, comments? Okay, seeing none. Why does Paul write the letter? Well, he's got several foci. He's got several reasons for writing. The first is midrash on scripture. What's midrash? Good, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you. Midrash is just a Hebrew word for when Jewish rabbis make commentary on the Old Testament scriptures. It's not really like a sermon. It's more like a Bible study, like what I'm doing with you now, making commentary on the book of Romans. The way you say that if you're a Jew is Rabbi put forward some midrash. He put forward some commentary on scripture. Paul comments on an awful lot of the Old Testament in broad strokes in terms of its thematic content. What's a big major theme of the letter to the Romans? Who wants to throw just one word out there? Starts with the letter F. I know a congregation named for this word. Faith. One of the biggest themes that Paul talks about is faith. And who is the poster child for faith in Paul's estimation? I'll give you a hint. It's not the Sunday school answer of Jesus or Moses. You're going to have to keep going down the line. Who's Paul's poster boy for faith? Abraham. Very good. Abraham. Paul's poster boy for faith is Abraham. So Paul spends an awful lot of time in the book of Romans commenting on Abraham's story. Well, that's midrash on the Old Testament. Y'all with me? That's commentary on the Old Testament scriptures. So that's one of the reasons that he writes. He also writes to bring structure and cohesion to the early Christian movement in Rome. These early house churches were very loosely organized because Christianity had gotten there and kind of if you can use this word this way, and Tim is still telling me I can't, organically, okay? So in other words, it hadn't coalesced around one leader or even two or three leaders. It was loosely organized. And so Paul is writing to bring some cohesion to the early Christian movement in Rome. Right with me? He's also writing because he's going to end up asking them for money. Is that too blunt of a way to put it for a Sunday morning? You're like, no, we've met pastors. Anyway, he's raising awareness of his ministry. A lot of the people in Rome may not even know who Paul is. So he's raising awareness of his ministry for the purposes of garnering future financial support for his missionary work. This is why in his letter, he talks about his desire to go to Spain. He wants the Roman Christians to help fund his missionary journey to Spain. Okay? So those are three big reasons. Now, why am I laying out those three big reasons for him to write the letter? Notice what's not in there. What's not in there is that Paul is not trying to establish a baseline for all of Christian doctrine. He's not writing Romans as a catechism. Right? Like you have a small catechism. That's a basis for Christian doctrine. It's laying out the basics. He is not writing Romans to lay out all the basics of Christian doctrine. Why is that important? I'll tell you in a minute. But it's important, I'll give you this teaser, it's important because of the way that Lutherans typically read Romans and other Protestant groups read Romans. They typically read Romans as if it's the basis for all of their doctrine. But that's not why Paul wrote it. Are y'all with me?
Does he write that way in other books?
He does, but let me come back to that question. It's a really good question, Joel, but I'm going to compare Romans to, say, 1 Corinthians to show you what I mean in a minute, okay? And I'm going to do it right now because I'm going to talk to you about the so-called new perspective on Paul. So there's a perspective on Paul, there's the so-called new perspective on Paul, and I'm going to tell you why it matters. Romans and the Lutheran and concurrently Protestant Reformation read Romans a certain way. Martin Luther came to his understanding of saving faith by reading the book of Romans. Did y'all know this? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, but no. I heard some no's. Okay.
Because in the Lutheran Study Bible, it says this epistle is really the chief part of the New Testament and is truly the purest gospel.
Right.
And so Luther wrote that, and
Right. So this was Luther's big epiphany moment. When Luther went from being terrified of God to trusting in God through Jesus Christ, it was when he was reading Romans. So Luther could not shut up about Romans. He went on and on and on about Romans because he had so personally benefited from reading Paul's teaching in Romans. And he said things like, this is the chief part of the entire New Testament. Like, this is it. I don't know what happened to the Gospels, Marty, but okay. But he's German. He's a German of a particular. Today we think of Germans as reserved, right? Germans weren't reserved in Luther's day. They were given to hyperbole. He called the Pope an ass playing a harp. These are not reserved people, okay? Don't get mad at me. I didn't say it. He said it. Get mad at Marty. I didn't use colorful language. He did, okay? So Germans at the time are given to hyperbole. He says, this is the most important book in the entire New Testament, okay? But then people listen to him. And so the way Lutherans read the New Testament after Martin Luther was that they did make Romans basically the ground and the base work for all of their Christian doctrine. Other Protestant groups after the Lutherans followed, okay? Contemporary scholarship beginning in 1963. How can you date it to 1963? Because we have a scholarly article, and it was published in 1963. There was this scholar in 1963 who published a groundbreaking paper that shook up the non-Catholic world because he argued that Luther read Romans as being about personal faith and personal salvation, and that is not what Paul was saying in the letter. People wanted to cry heresy. They wanted to rip this scholar from limb from limb. They wanted to hang him from the highest tree. The Catholics sat back and laughed. After this scholar published this paper in 1963, a bunch of other scholars followed suit and came up with what's called today the new perspective on Paul, which is an attempt to recover Paul's intention, like his original intention in writing Romans. Everybody with me? Am I going to give you the new perspective on Paul? No. No. First of all, because this is a Lutheran church and I'm not stupid. I'm kidding. Sort of. Anyway, why am I not going to give you the new perspective on Paul? Because like a lot of things, guys, I think the new perspective on Paul swings the pendulum too far the other direction. Okay? Here's what I'll tell you. This is the world according to Will Miller. The new perspective on Paul raised helpful questions when studying Paul, and specifically the book of Romans. It helped us to think of new questions that we were not asking before since the Lutheran Reformation 500 years ago. Let me give you an example that's not the book of Romans for what I'm talking about. The Pentecostal movement started in the Azusa Street Revival in the 1900s in Los Angeles, California. All Pentecostal churches in the United States trace their lineage back to the Azusa Street Revival. If I teach you about the Holy Spirit, am I going to teach you Pentecostal doctrine? No. But will I talk to you about Pentecostalism because they raised some helpful questions about the Holy Spirit that the Lutherans were not asking before the Pentecostal movement started in America? Yes. See what I'm saying about the new perspective scholars? I think they raised some helpful questions. I don't agree with their conclusions. Okay? What kinds of questions did they raise that I think might be helpful? Well, as someone who started out this class telling you that I used to be Baptist, I told you other Protestant groups followed Martin Luther's reading on Romans and made it the basis for all of their doctrine. Now, Joel, let's get to your question about how Paul writes in other letters. If Romans is your basis for your doctrine, does Paul ever address something pretty darn important like the Lord's Supper? Does he ever address it in Romans? Do you know? We're fixing to know because we're going to go through it together. The answer is no. He addresses it in 1 Corinthians. In fact, if you were to go through Ephesians, Galatians, and 1 Corinthians, which I actually have gone through with y'all, you get more of Paul's doctrinal content in those letters if you put them all together. So why did I take you through those letters? Because I'm basically taking you through the chief parts of the catechism, except in the Bible rather than in your catechism. I'm taking you through the scriptures where your catechism comes from. Does that make sense? A lot of your catechism is not contained in Romans. But a lot of Protestant groups followed Martin Luther's effusive comments on Romans. Oh, it's the chief part of the entire New Testament. I grew up Baptist. They don't understand the Lord's Supper. They think they understand it. They don't understand. They don't understand baptism. Well, Paul talks a lot about baptism. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about where that misunderstanding could come in from Paul, but in Romans at least. But if you don't understand baptism and you don't understand the Lord's Supper, are you going to necessarily get that cleared up in the book of Romans? Well, not if you misunderstand what Paul is saying about baptism, and Paul is easily misunderstood in chapter 6 through 8 of Romans on baptism, and Paul doesn't even address the Lord's Supper. So if you make Romans as out to be like it's the basis for Christian doctrine, you're going to have holes. Does that make sense? So the New Perspective scholars brought up some questions that are helpful so that we don't do with Romans what maybe we shouldn't do with Romans. That being said, the other thing that the new scholars bring up is that they say that Luther was wrong because Paul was not talking about personal faith and salvation. Okay, fine. He wasn't. I'll say it. He wasn't. Does that mean that Luther was wrong to read it the way he read it? No. Every generation has come away from the book of Romans with something a little bit different. One of the very first commentaries we ever had on the book of Romans was written by a guy, maybe some of you have heard of him, St. Augustine. Anybody ever hear of that guy? Okay. Do you know, where was Augustine from? Anybody know? He was from Hippo in North Africa. It was like the grain belt of the Roman Empire. In other words, I'm telling you, it was boring there. It was just grain fields as far as you could see. Augustine was like from Iowa. I'm just letting you know. Nebraska, Kansas. I'm telling you, he's your people. If you've never read St. Augustine, he is your people. He's one of the smartest guys to ever come out of a wheat field you've ever met in your life, okay? He's your people. He's like from the middle, somewhere in there, okay? One of the first commentaries on Romans that we have is actually from St. Augustine, and he didn't get exactly the same things that Luther got out of it, and it was hugely influential in all of Christianity until Luther had his comments on Romans. Every generation gets something a little different. That's why this letter is so important. It's why it shapes so much of world history. Are y'all with me? But to point that out does not mean that Luther's wrong. Are y'all with me? Or are you not with me? Okay. So we're not going to do the New Perspective, although we're going to admit that the New Perspective raised some helpful questions. Is that fair enough? Okay. This guy, Marty Luther, continues to cast a huge shadow over the study of St. Paul and his writings. Okay? And that's good for Lutherans. And we've got a lot that we can dig into in this study together over the coming weeks. Here's the problem with his comments on Romans. Carol, you read what you said Luther wrote on Romans. Here's the problem, Carol. Luther didn't write that. He said it. Luther's comment, so Luther wrote a huge commentary on the book of Galatians. It is impressive if you ever read it. It is impressive. He wrote that one. Everything he said about Romans, he said in university lecture. And his students and the other faculty members at Wittenberg were so taken with what he said that they published his comments without his consent and without him ever editing any of them. And as someone who lectures in a university lecture hall myself, I think, yikes. Because there's plenty of things I've said off the cuff that I would not include in the commentary. Okay? This is not the first time this ever happened to Luther in his long and illustrious career. His 95 theses were not meant to be published. Somebody took his 95 theses to a printing press and then distributed them throughout Germany without Luther's permission. Did y'all know that, or did you think he meant for that to go out? Okay, you thought he meant for that to go out. Some of you did. No, he did not mean for that to go out. He meant for that to be a posting for a formal academic debate that he wanted to have to all challengers. And he wanted to have it in a university lecture hall. When he posted it on the church door, that was like the local bulletin board. He had the 95 theses next to a thing that said, looking for a roommate, and then it had all the tabs at the bottom, and they pulled some of the tabs off to make you think someone else was interested, so maybe you'll get interested. And then next to that, it said, are you looking for guitar lessons? Same thing, had the little pull tabs at the bottom. Y'all know what I'm talking about? The 95 Theses, believe it or not, was posted on a bulletin board. It was a public bulletin. That's the church door. It was a public bulletin board. Someone took it off the bulletin board, took it to a printing press, and then they distributed it throughout Germany without Luther's knowledge. The first time Luther learned about it, he was picking up a copy going, oops, my superiors might have something to say about this, okay? So the same thing happened to his lectures on Romans. He lectured all these comments in a university classroom, and his students were so blown away, and the other faculty members who took time to go listen to him were so blown away that they distributed all these comments, okay? He didn't think they were ready for public consumption, but this is some of the things he said. He said, it is worthy not only that every Christian should know it, meaning Romans, by heart, but also that he should occupy himself with it every day as the daily bread of his soul. Okay, Marty, tell us what you really think. Now, if you were in a university, now think about this. If this were a commentary, that would be overblown. But if you're in a university lecture hall and you're trying to get through to young mushheads, might you as a teacher, like maybe overstate it just a little bit to let them know you think this is super important? I'm looking at some of my teachers here. You would never overstate the importance of it, right? Just to get them excited, right? He wanted his students to be excited about the book of Romans. So he told them it was like the most important thing ever, right? Are you with me? Okay. It's also a book that had a near and dear place for Luther personally in his own story. I told you he came to his own breakthrough by reading the book of Romans. This is what he said. My situation was that although an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner troubled in conscience and had no confidence that my character would satisfy him. Night and day I pondered. Then I grasped that the justice of God is the righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy, he justifies us through faith. Immediately, I felt myself to have gone through open doors into paradise. Marty Luther felt the way he felt about Romans because for him, this was the big aha moment. And that's okay. That's a good thing. But that's Marty's story, not necessarily yours. Are you with me? So we are going to talk about Martin Luther and his influence on how we read Romans as a bunch of Lutherans. But I'm also going to ask you to do some thinking for yourself as we go to see how this letter's hitting you too. Okay? And if the way that it hits you is a little bit different than the way it hit old Marty Luther, that's going to be okay. You're not guilty of heresy. This is my point when I'm trying to make to y'all that this Romans is not the basis for all Christian doctrine. It's not the same as your small catechism as drawn from all the scriptures and outlining the major themes of all the scriptures. Are you with me? And sometimes because of the way Martin Luther exerts this undue influence, it's massive, his influence on the studies about St. Paul and the studies about the book of Romans, because his shadow is a big one. Sometimes Lutherans will read Romans, and if they get a different something that they come up with other than what Marty said, they go, oh no, I must be guilty of bad teaching. Not necessarily, you could be. Let's not rule that out. But you may not be. You may just come to a different something when you're reading Romans than Marty did. And we're going to make that okay. Does that sound good to y'all? Okay. Carol?
Well, that commentary on Romans 1:17, I'd like to read it. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith.
Yeah, that's just Paul's words.
That's in Romans.
Right, that's just Paul's words in the first 17 verses. Yeah, absolutely.
Paul.
Yeah, that's Paul's words, not Luther's words. That's Paul's. Yeah, absolutely.
He commented on that. That was
Yeah, that was what he was commenting upon. Absolutely. And we're going to look at in depth at that together. But my point is, Don't try not to put yourself up against Marty Luther and think you're wrong just because you got something different out of it. We'll talk about the way Lutherans read Romans and why we read it the way we read it, okay? But that'll be a broader conversation than just Luther himself. Everybody with me? Okay. It'll include Luther, but it'll be broader than Luther. Is that fair? Fair way to go about it? Then you have homework. For next week, I want you to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, and only verses 1 through 17. Why stop at 17? Because starting in 18, he's going to get into some real stuff that we're going to have to spend a minute on. So next week is just the first 17 verses. Romans chapter 1, 1 through 17. Everybody with me? I love you, Jesus loves you. Go away. Good to see you, my dear.
Still one more week.